eagle-eyed viewers might notice this is an older logo we've got going there. But I'm delighted to welcome my two guests. Did we lose Lewis? There we
I'm
go.
here.
Okay. God, I'm just on the wrong side of this thing today. Okay. Lewis, Leo, welcome back to the show. Jared, Beck, gentlemen, how you guys doing tonight?
Good. Thanks for having me.
I'm doing well. Thank you, Jason.
Jared's still hunkered down there in South Korea. Lewis is joining us from South Florida. So it's a real southern kind of atmosphere here, South Korea, South Florida. Lewis, you were with us last time, and we played that really impressive clip where you spoke in front of was it the city council?
It's the Board of County Commissioners for Palm Beach County who essentially were deciding whether or not to pass a mandate for the masks.
And since then, they have passed it, correct?
Yeah, the first video that I think you played on your show was the early May meeting, but then we had a meeting last week. They essentially voted 7-0 after an overwhelming public, I would say, opposition to the mandate itself, and they unanimously passed the mandate despite everybody who opposed it.
Wow. That's amazing that these people who are supposed to represent the public actually ignore and basically harass the public. This is part of the reason why Jared left South Florida with his family. The situation's become virtually untenable over there it's not just South Florida. We're having the same kinds of things happening all around the country. And Lewis, I'm so delighted that you've joined us because there's just not that many people who are doing anything, and most people don't know what they can do, but you, as a civil rights attorney, have been standing up to this. Why don't you tell us all what it is that's happened and how you are fighting this thing?
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we of course did not want to sue the county. We tried to avoid litigation and appeal to their the sensibilities of these people, especially trying to educate them on the law, which is very clear, especially the Florida Constitution. And, I've seen various public officials essentially argue that the First Amendment, is somehow trumped by a pandemic, but that's not what the law says. That's not what the case law says. And, when they talk about just the First Amendment, well, there's a lot more than that, especially in Florida. In Florida, we have the Florida Constitution, and freedom of speech is actually also protected under Article 1, Section 4 of the Florida Constitution. So you can't talk about the First Amendment without also, in Florida at least, without also bringing up freedom of speech under the, Florida Constitution. So, many different rights are being violated by the mask mandate. It's not just freedom of speech like some politicians have been misled to believe. It's also the right to privacy, which is Article 1, Section 23 of the Florida Constitution. There's also basic rights, which is Article 1, Section 2, which is what I actually read to the Board of County Commissioners because they seem to have forgotten it. There's also Article 1, Section 9, which is due process under Florida Constitution. So there's many rights that have been violated. But before you even get to the constitutionality or the unconstitutionality of this mandate, it's completely without power, or ultra vires, as they say in Latin, which essentially means that they didn't have the authority under Florida law to do this. This mandate is inconsistent also with both Florida, statutes and the Florida Constitution, which is essentially against the authority as well, which they cannot do things that are inconsistent with the Constitution, which is essentially the law of the land, right? It supersedes the county and even state officials, rulemaking powers, or in this case, emergency powers.
Yeah, it's too bad we can't get a group of lawyers together to tie some ropes around these statutes and rip them down to the ground like so many leftists have been doing with monuments around the country. So Jared, what do you think about what's going on? This is, well, you don't live in Palm Beach County, but South Florida, this is the type of thing that when one county does it, another might, right, and you move in and you move around in that county. What are the implications of what Lewis has initiated here?
Well, a few thoughts. number one is, we've been out of the country for a little while, but I've been following the news, and I believe that Miami-Dade County passed its own mandate recently. I know the city of Miami Beach did. Broward County has. There are other counties. In Florida at least, these kind of mandates are pursuing on a locality by locality basis. And what Lewis just articulated, I think, is exactly right, which is that these mandates violate a whole raft of constitutional protections that are really part of our constitutional tradition as Americans, and they run roughshod over them without proper process. And it's really quite strange and extraordinary that suddenly all across the country you have these mandates to have people basically wear a medical device on their face in response to the supposed presence of an airborne respiratory illness. I mean, this really has never happened in our country's history, at least as far as I can tell. And in terms of my perspective on this currently, being in South Korea is kind of interesting because, one of the reasons among others, that I wanted to get out here was to really see for myself how other countries and societies are addressing this, purported worldwide pandemic that's crushing the United States right now. And South Korea is kind of interesting because if people will recall, it was one of the countries that early on was in the news as being heavily affected by the coronavirus. And then South Korea took some measures, and now, if you compare South Korea to, say, my home state of Florida, the number of cases and the number of deaths is really quite minuscule. So by all appearances, it would seem that South Korea has this under control. And what's interesting is that when Elizabeth and I got here with our family, our two young daughters, we were immediately sent into a quarantine facility for 2 weeks, where we were probed and tested by medical staff in hazmat suits, and we were confined to a hotel room for 2 straight weeks. We couldn't even, go into other parts of the hotel. We had to stay in our hotel room, and food was delivered to us and at the door 3 times a day. And we were required to install a special application on our phone and input our temperature twice a day. Okay. Wow. Once the 2-week quarantine period, I mean, it really sounds quite extreme, and it was a crazy experience. But once the 2-week quarantine period ended, a bus showed up, and it took us out of the hotel and dropped us off at a metro station, and then we went to the Airbnb that we had reserved, and that's where we are currently. And we're out and about in society, and you see a lot of people wearing face masks. My understanding is that it's required here only when you're taking public transportation, but most people wear them. Now, I want to say something about that. Number one, that's not really unusual as far as my experiences in Korea, because we were here in 2017, and a lot of people were wearing masks back then. In fact, my understanding is that in East Asian countries, it's become quite common for people to wear face masks in public because there's air quality issues here. There's a historic experiences with other of these so-called pandemics, like the SARS and the MERS viruses. So people do wear masks a lot. I mean, this predates coronavirus. But number two is once you get into the restaurants and the bars, they are fully open for business, and people are seated elbow to elbow in very packed circumstances, absolutely no social distancing. Commerce is very lively, so it doesn't seem like, from the inside of these establishments that there's any kind of pandemic going on. In fact, yesterday we ate at one of these sushi restaurants. I don't know if you've been in these sushi restaurants where the chef makes the sushi and then they stick it on like a rotating conveyor belt.
Sushi kaiten.
Okay, so you know what I'm talking about. And there's a large conveyor belt sushi restaurant near our Airbnb, and the place was absolutely packed, and you have these plates of sushi going around a conveyor belt all throughout the restaurant. You would think that if there was a pandemic going on, that would be the first place that would be shut down, because you have food coming into contact with various areas of the air in the restaurant before people pick it up and eat it. But it's going on like normal. People are sitting very close together. So there's a lot of weird contradictions that I'm noticing. And, I wouldn't say that the response here is akin to the response that we're seeing in the U.S. in some localities, where there's just this, mandatory mask mandates are passed, and restaurants and other establishments are being totally crippled because they can't open for business. I mean, that's just not the case here. So, I don't know if, one might say, well, maybe the Korean approach is to just keep as many people as possible out of the country by imposing this very onerous quarantine requirements, such as we had to go through, and then assuming that, now that all the bad foreigners with the potential of carrying coronavirus are kept out of the country, life can go on pretty much as normal and masks are worn in public. I don't know. These are just sort of the impressions I've had here, but it seems to me that there's a different response in South Korea than what is being experienced in the U.S., especially as these the number of cases is reported to be escalating in Florida and other states.
I'm glad you brought this up, Jared, because, I've been to South Korea. I've mentioned this before on the show, was working on a movie there, and I really did enjoy these sushi kaiten restaurants. There were some that, as you say, just had sushi floating by open air, and, some people might find that unappealing. It's actually noteworthy to mention that, to my knowledge, one kaiten sushi restaurant had attempted to open in New York City, but Americans, and particularly New Yorkers' response to this notion of sushi just, rolling around in front of you on a conveyor belt was negative. It was rejected, and the restaurant failed. A lot of the places have them covered like this. I've been to these types of sushi restaurants in Tokyo, Singapore, and Seoul, and they are quite popular. And what you mentioned is of particular interest, because you're approaching this from an empirical standpoint as a lawyer who's very interested in evidence, something quite similar to the way a scientist might approach something. Without evidence, it can't be considered valid. But it seems to me that what you're describing are kind of like cultural norms. Another thing that I found quite odd when I went to Korea, I was there on business, so we had a number of business lunches and things like that with people who I didn't really know. And in one instance, we went into a restaurant. I'm sure you can confirm this. All restaurants in Korea, you are not allowed to wear your shoes in there, because that would be disgusting. But when soup came out at this table of 10 people, everybody had a gigantic long spoon, and we were all eating out of the same bowl of soup, which was so shocking to me. I mean, I did it because I didn't want to appear to be, not part of this business meeting, but that would never fly. And I mean, in my instance, I didn't get sick from it. Perhaps the soup is hot enough that whatever germs are in your mouth don't survive on the spoon, but that would never, ever get past first base at a restaurant in the United States. And perhaps the mask wearing and things, it kind of falls into that category. It maybe gives people a psychological sense of something, but there's actually no scientific data that proves that it works. And Louis, this is a lot of what you were relying on in your suit, isn't it?
Well, if you're talking about the science behind the mask mandate, there is none. It's essentially pseudoscience. They're just really making it up as they go. It seems largely from propaganda and disinformation. And if you look at our complaint, you can see we outline several studies, the actual science that it shows that the masks are actually harmful, especially when you wear them for long term. And that's a very simple thing to understand, because when you cover your mouth, you're restricting oxygen into your body, and you need oxygen to live. This is basic science that these people are ignoring when they essentially say that putting the mask on keeps you safe somehow. They can't actually show you a study that says, one, it's safe, or a study that shows, two, it stops the spread of a disease, which we know that the COVID is so microscopically small that it can go through most masks.
Right. And people can go to your website, floridациvilrights.org, and read the full complaint as well as the attached exhibits that include some references to these scientific studies. So what's this? This is a class action suit that you've brought on behalf. No?
Not a class action technically. It's they're individual plaintiffs, suing on their own behalf. But because it's an issue that affects everybody. It's a matter, it's a matter of public interest and public concern, and they're essentially trying to strike down the order entirely, and which is, by the way, presumptively unconstitutional because it infringes upon the right of privacy, and we can talk about that if you'd like.
Yeah, please.
Essentially in Florida, and this isn't to be confused with the right of privacy under the U.S. Constitution, and we outline this in the complaint. The due process under Florida law, Article 1, Section 9, essentially, Article 1, Section 23, essentially covers the right to medical freedom, the right to bodily autonomy, and to not only to choose but to refuse medical treatment. And I think it's important that people understand when they're looking at this lawsuit, this isn't focused on the U.S. Constitution and just the free First Amendment or rights guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. We're talking about the Florida Constitution and multiple rights, including a fundamental human right, the right to have control over your body and your bodily autonomy.
Wow. It's a really good point. And, there are other lawsuits cropping up here and there. I don't know that there's one exactly like the one that you've done. I know that Pamela Geller, I think, was suing Cuomo or de Blasio. I haven't heard very much about that suit. So this has been filed just a couple days ago, right? When did you file this suit?
Yeah, we filed it earlier this week. The court has already issued an order requiring the defendant county to respond within 10 days to the motion, because along with the complaint for declaratory judgment and permanent injunctive relief, we also filed a motion for emergency injunctive relief on a preliminary basis because of the likelihood of success on the merits.
That's good. And the fact that the court would act on that seems like a positive response, doesn't it? It's hard to know.
Yes. I mean, the court could have granted an injunction and required the defendant to respond as well. So he didn't give us the injunction, that we were asking for immediately. But it's a good indication that we're going to get a hearing on this, which was discretionary. The court could essentially have denied the emergency motion and refused to accept it as an emergency. But it seems as if, and Jared, you correct me if I'm wrong, it seems as if the court has treated this as an emergency and is giving it that consideration.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
It's very tricky to know in these court cases. I mean, sometimes you think obviously nobody would enter into a lawsuit expecting to lose, but it's just the outcomes are so unpredictable. And it's so complicated, all this knowledge that you need to have. We see people running around in the street telling cops it's their right to, run into a closed-off zone and express their freedom of speech 2 o'clock in the morning in an area that's been designated dangerous and shut down. They think it's their right to tell people not to photograph or video record them when they're engaged in crimes in public. People don't really know what the law is, but even when you are an expert in the law, like you two gentlemen, it's just so unpredictable how these things can go. So we've got a video here, Louis. Why don't we run this video? Give us a little bit of a lead in. What is this?
Is this the one from last week? Before the vote?
Staff requests direction regarding mandatory facial coverings. I think this is the one you sent me, right?
Yeah, that's the last. That was the meeting they had before they passed the mandate.
So
and I spoke. Interestingly, we were supposed to have 3 minutes. Before the public comment period began, they cut us to 2 minutes.
Oh yeah.
Medical professional, but I represent people who have been harmed by medical professionals, as well as government employees and officials. I've spent many years studying the harmful effects of CDC recommendations. You'll see signs around here that say vaccines are known to cause seizures, encephalitis, and autoimmunity. That's not my beliefs. Those are just facts, scientifically provable facts. So I encourage you to research, okay? By the looks of this chamber, it is clear that many have fallen for propaganda and pseudoscience. I think we need to learn about that. If we're going to educate people, let's learn about pseudoscience. It's coming largely from unethical organizations who profit from sickness and eliminating not just civil rights, but human rights under the guise of disease prevention. If the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program has taught parents who are paying attention anything, it is that CDC recommendations can cause serious harm and even death. We have now seen reports of kids dying while exercising with facial coverings on. People have passed out while wearing masks, driving, and crashed their cars. If anyone, let alone a child, is injured or dies as a result of an unlawful countywide mask mandate, is the county attorney, are the officials in this room prepared for the legal consequences? That's a serious question. Are you prepared to face individual liability because you won't have qualified immunity because you know what you're doing is wrong? Are you prepared to face that individual liability for the products you are mandating and deceptively marketing? Johns Hopkins University's recent study on medical errors has revealed that doctors and hospitals kill more than 250,000 Americans each year by mistake. Where's the chart on that? So while nobody in this room can prove scientifically that masks protect people from catching COVID, and keeping in mind the fact that a goat and a fruit have tested positive for COVID, and many tests have been mysteriously contaminated by the CDC, the fact still remains that Americans are more likely to be killed by their doctor or struck by lightning than die from COVID-19.
Counsel, your time has expired.
You got to make sure you don't get that fruity goat virus, because that is uncurable. Give us some more background on that, because people are watching now who maybe didn't see you the first time. What was the story with that fruit and goat test?
I think it was Tanzania. The president had tested the test. I've been saying this for a long time now. Who's testing the test, right? We've seen reports that some of these tests have been, or many of these tests have been contaminated. But my understanding is that the president of Tanzania, suspecting there was some funny business going on, had these tests tested. He identified them as people when it was just a goat, I think a fruit, papaya or something like that. They tested, and essentially the test, it came back positive. So then they suspended the lab, and my understanding is did some kind of investigation. But of course, you didn't hear about this in the United States. This was largely ignored and one of those swept under the rug stories, I think, for the most part.
Yeah, and there have been a lot of stories coming out, mostly in alternative news, although there was one nurse who had just straight out accused Elmhurst Hospital Center of murdering people. Now, I've been meaning to ask both of you guys this. Doesn't it surprise you if a nurse would put out a video that's got over 1 million views and then appear on Fox News, which is a national news broadcast that gets millions of viewers? She said that she had a 37-year-old patient who she evaluated and thought was recovering, and then somehow they had convinced her to leave the room. They intubated this patient, put a ventilator down his throat, and then the next time she saw him, they were clearing out the room. The patient had died. Now, I have to presume, when you describe a 37-year-old patient dying of coronavirus at Elmhurst Hospital Center, there can't be 3 patients that meet that description. I'd be surprised if there were 2. It seems to me that there should be a family in Queens saying, hey, wait a minute. We had a 37-year-old son, brother, father, whatever, who died, and here we have an employee of the hospital accusing them of murder. I have tried almost every day for 3 months to contact the media office for Elmhurst Hospital and for New York Health and Hospitals, which is a public hospital system that's funded by taxpayer money, which I am one, and I'm calling them to ask them important questions about this. They've hung up the phone on me. They refuse to answer email. Can you conceive of this? Wouldn't there be an army of lawyers swarming on this hospital that's being accused of negligence and killing people?
Wow. Well,
You go first, Jared.
here, I'll give you my 2 cents, and then I'm interested to hear what Lewis has to say. I mean, look, I think we're in the fog of war, and that's why information is so hard to obtain. And I would say, with respect to the coronavirus, there's 3 P's to keep in mind. Okay, pseudoscience, propaganda, and psychology. Okay, I believe that this.
Oh, you're back.
Fair. I think coronavirus.
Sorry, Jared, we lost you there.
We lost
Wait,
you.
You believe
P's.
what?
Go back to the
Okay,
P's.
I'll reiterate the 3 P's.
Yeah.
The 3 P's being pseudoscience, propaganda, and psychology. Okay, because I believe that coronavirus is an element of psychological warfare. I think it's being waged in a very targeted and effective manner, and right now it's primarily targeting the United States. And I think that, like all psychological warfare battles, you really have to dig into the psychology and understand how it's affecting people at a psychological level. I don't think it's any accident that the coronavirus, the onset of the coronavirus pandemic was followed by the George Floyd incident, and then the protests, the slogan of which emerged immediately was, "I can't breathe." Well, what does "I can't breathe" tell you? Well, it's the same thing as when you put a covering over your nose. You can't breathe. So through the coronavirus operation, people are being sort of placed in this position of not being able to breathe, which they associate with George Floyd and the concept of the government stepping on their necks. And I think it's a way of making people feel powerless and dehumanized, which is what a face covering does. Especially in a society like ours, which doesn't have a custom of wearing them outside. That may be different in certain Asian countries, which have been wearing face coverings for a long part of their history, but it's certainly not part of the history in the West. So to suddenly introduce a new cultural norm in society like this, which obscures the face, impedes breathing, you're doing some very major psychological fuckery, if I can apply a non-scientific term.
Yeah.
But I think it explains people's reactions, which are all over the map. But generally, you see people doing everything from straight out compliance, to being really agitated and worked up, and lambasting others when they don't comply. And we've been getting the legal team behind this lawsuit has been getting all kinds of hate mail from propagandized individuals who think that we're a menace to society because we're trying to enforce the Constitution. So when you see, just to get back to your question, Jason, when you see a situation where a nurse comes out in front of the camera and describes a specific patient who she believes has been murdered by hospital staff, you have to analyze that piece of video from every angle, including the possibility that it's counter propaganda and describes a situation that doesn't exist. Because in a war, there are people on both sides of every issue and every battle. So everything has to be scrutinized from that angle. That's what I would say.
And Jared, this nurse is publishing a book. Simon & Schuster is publishing a book about this nurse who, I mean, this is like a legal nightmare to have a major publishing company release a book by someone who is accused. I mean, that's a lot of stuff for lawyers to look at, isn't it?
Yeah, you would think, but Simon Schuster's also a big deep state publishing company that goes back many, many years, and that to me raises suspicions right off the bat about whether this is an authentic whistleblower or somebody that's been inserted into this operation because there's a desire to, at the end of the day, fragment American society into different camps, and the coronavirus is one particular battle, which is why, just getting back to all the points Lewis was making, I mean, it's so important to look at things from the point of view of an objective, reasonable analysis that considers data and actual scientific studies rather than going off of anecdote or hearsay or impressions from either the mainstream media or social media or what have you. And that's exactly what's not being done in the conversation in the U.S. right now or in any of the policy making. And I think that's the really scary part, is that there's nobody helming the ship of state. I mean, we're floating there without a rudder, really. And it's a very scary position to be in.
Yeah.
So now, Lewis,
Jason,
what do you think about this?
I just wanted to chime in on this, Erin's video. I'm a friend with her on Facebook, and I watched her full interview with the gentleman. I think it was like an hour long, overview of many different clips that she had recorded, and she was discussing one that just stands out in my mind. I think she said that the only person that lived that was on a ventilator that she saw, actually pulled it out of himself.
Right.
And what was shocking to me was the number of drugs that these people were being put on, including fentanyl, which I think the questioner asked her, how is it possible that the person extubated himself? And she said it was because he was, I guess, a drug user or something like that. So he perhaps wasn't as sedated as other patients were. But the big, I think, scary thing of this is the fact that these are patients who have no one there to look out for them, and the hospitals are doing this all over the country, probably all over the world, using COVID as an excuse to deny people access to their family, and friends. And that's typically, I think, what stands between a patient and a doctor. And it's kind of like a check and balance, especially when doctors who love to do tests and want to give you drugs and surgeries and things like that are left to their own devices. It's a problem. And I brought up that Johns Hopkins study because I think people are missing the bigger picture. They're looking at only one set of data. They're looking at only the COVID positivity. Right? They're not even really examining the death rate. They're not even really closely examining, the data and looking at the false positives, but they're not taking into consideration the fact that doctors kill far more people than COVID has or will. And they kill, over 250,000 people a year just in the United States. And that's the ones that they have to actually admit because there's no, way of covering it up. It's whoops, it was a medical error, it's coded in the data. How many real deaths are there that we'll never consider death by doctor, right? Like the chemo deaths and the SIDS, the sudden infant deaths that no one attributes to vaccination. Officially, this is something that people really need to have a bigger discussion about. And if Erin, I don't know, I don't know her that well, and I don't know what her motivation is to get the story out there. But I'm looking forward to reading this book and to see if there's more video. I'd like to see it if it's going to be put out there. And if it's false, if it's a scam, then the hospital would be suing her for defamation and moving for, protective orders and trying to seal this if this is patient data that's being released, unlawfully or something. That would probably bring up HIPAA and other issues. So I'm curious to learn more about this. I was really upset, if anything, about the Tucker Carlson coverage of this, because he didn't really talk about the issues, and he didn't even talk about the gentleman who pulled the tube out of his body to save his own life. I mean, which to me is I think the most shocking part of that story is that you have patients are being possibly killed by I would call it medical malpractice, if anything, and then you have the one guy saves himself. And he actually, credits the doctors there with saving his life. I think is what Erin had said in the longer interview, and it was, to me, it really does show us the dysfunction in the medical system in this country. And any attorney who's handled a malpractice case will tell you this is a serious problem. Doctors have immunity from many different things they do, and they have they've created through legislation some of these statutes we need to pull down, in ways to insulate themselves, so that you have to find a doctor, for example, that says what happened was malpractice before you can even sue a doctor for malpractice in Florida. And that's how it is in many states, I understand.
Yeah, I want to be careful that we're not presenting as a totally anti-medical, at least I'm not. I acknowledge that what you're saying is accurate, and in any kind of large system, there's going to be people who are incompetent, irresponsible, even malicious. But in my personal experience, most doctors are trying very hard, and this concept of qualified immunity, it's come up a lot lately. There are certain jobs that we want people to do where there is an inherent risk of death. I mean, if you're going to be a brain surgeon or a cardiologist or an oncologist, where there is a high degree of risk that even doing what appears to be the right thing could result in a death or a small mistake. I mean, no person can be held to a standard of 100% accuracy 100% of the time. I don't think any of us could. I mean, right now I'm having an unwanted outcome on this video. I don't have the right logo. If that would result in somebody's death, I wouldn't even engage in attempting this if I wasn't reassured with this concept of qualified immunity. And of course, it's a very complicated issue for lawyers and legislators and other people to get involved in, but there are certain jobs where we do need to give people a certain degree of immunity from prosecution, because doing the job, look, lawyers have immunity from lawsuits in what they do, and I think a lot of people would question that. Politicians have immunity. Police, we've been hearing a lot about qualified immunity. But just to stay on this book for one more moment, setting aside any personal relationship or whether or not we believe Erin or we disbelieve Erin or whatever, just looking at this book cover from the standpoint of two attorneys, let's say one or both of you guys were hired to be the general counsel for Simon & Schuster, and someone came to you with a story that you hadn't even researched, but they said they wanted to make the cover, to make the title, Undercover Epicenter Nurse, how fraud, negligence, and greed led to death. These are conclusory statements, aren't they? This is an incredible amount of liability that Simon & Schuster is taking on if the hospital is able to even cast any doubt on these presumptions that these things cause death, right?
Yeah, they're very, it's a very provocative statement.
They're
Why would they allow that?
Essentially, they obviously have evidence. If they didn't, then there's going to be a massive, defamation suit, I would imagine, or something else.
I would say it's not necessarily that they have evidence; it's that they know that they're not going to be sued. which leads me to believe that Elmhurst is some kind of staging area for this larger operation. There's a lot of things about Elmhurst that just, from the from the fact that it's located in Queens, which has this sort of inherent significance, given that it's where the president is from,
Right.
to the fact that it was pinpointed at the very beginning of this coronavirus epidemic as sort of the epicenter, to the fact that it's just very, very hard to get good information out of there. It seems to me that this is sort of a controlled staging area for something, and what exactly that is, is not something that we as outsiders to the internal processes of the deep state really know or can access at this point in time. But I'm very suspicious of people that like end up on Fox News or immediately writing bestsellers published by Simon & Schuster, because those people tend to be selected. They don't, and I'm not trying to cast aspersions on this nurse. I'm not trying to say that anything she did, isn't authentic or genuine, but it has all of the elements of staging. And I really think that the staging aspect of this coronavirus is paramount because it's wreaking psychological havoc on people. And, if you wanted to bring down the United States society, you don't want people to trust their institutions. And those institutions include hospitals and doctors, right?
What do you think of that, Lewis?
Well, I think that when we're talking about doctors, we can't not talk about medical error. And so, without getting into conspiracy theories, I think it's interesting that people now are treating constitutional rights as conspiracy theories, as we've seen in some of the publications recently about the mask mandates. And I think it's important that people recognize that a mask, for example, like this person's wearing in this picture, that's a medical treatment. Okay, like we're talking about the county, the state, whoever's imposing the mask mandate, which in our case, the Palm Beach County officials are the ones who are imposing the mask mandate. It's not the state. The state surgeon general hasn't required hasn't mandated masks be worn in Florida, and the governor of Florida hasn't required it. He's even said that the Constitution isn't suspended when there's a pandemic. So you have county officials, local officials who are limited in their powers, by the way, by Florida law, imposing a required medical treatment. They're now playing doctors, and we've outlined in our complaint how it's essentially unlicensed practice of medicine. This is, and it violates what's called the patient's Bill of Rights. At least in Florida, we have something like that. I can't speak for New York or any other states that I'm not licensed to practice law in, but the Florida Patient's Bill of Rights is important because it has something in there that other states don't. The right to refuse treatment, and not just refuse treatment, but to refuse any information from their doctor. Even if the doctor says, you got to do this, you're going to die, right? You have the right to say, no, thanks, doctor. And I can go and, burn some sage or something. It's that's your choice. And that all stems from the right to privacy under Florida law, which I really believe maybe these officials who are doing this, maybe they've been wearing their mask too long,
Brain damage.
They're not getting oxygen into their brain, and so they're suffering from brain damage because they clearly, the words on the paper say what they say, and they're just it's maybe they have the mask on wrong. Maybe they're wearing it like this when they're in their office.
Well, but Lewis, what you're saying right now,
it's you're talking to these people, and this is what it like really feels like. That it feels like they're wearing it across their eyes, and they're blind to what's going on. Maybe that's
absolutely.
Maybe that's not just malfeasance. Maybe, and it's corruption. Maybe they're guided by something other than logic.
Yeah, I really like what Lewis said there, because I personally believe that excessive exposure to propaganda manifests itself as a disease, as brain damage. I mean, it is a form of brain damage. You are assaulting your brain with bad information and changing the neural pathways so that your thinking becomes impaired. And it's not just
That's
information.
interesting.
I mean, it's all sorts of symbology,
Imagery and sounds and being put in a situation. It's interesting because you know what Lewis is talking about with regard to this mandated mask and forcing people to take a medical treatment. It goes right back to what we were discussing last time, which is Alan Dershowitz saying that Jacobson v. Massachusetts grants the state the power to force you to do whatever medical thing they decide is right. But when we sort of couple these ideas together, we look at what Jared is saying, that, you know, polluting the minds of every citizen, including lawmakers, with this false information, it could lead to incorrect conclusions and even damage. So that's quite troubling if they're going to try to invoke some of these laws and things like that. I see we have a younger Beck with us there. Yeah. I want to ask you guys real quickly, because I want to go back to what we were talking about earlier, some of the contradictions that we've seen along the way.
Oh, can we talk about The View too? We really should talk about The View, because the most amazing, I think, thing about the Palm Beach County mask mandate debacle is that it was picked up nationally, and they took only 3 people. They took snippets, little sound bites of 3 people who spoke out of over 50 who spoke against the mandate before it was enacted, and there's only a handful of people who spoke in favor of the mandate. But of course, the media spin on that was wild. And they made it seem like the majority was the minority, and they only showed you, they didn't show you the doctors. There's doctors who spoke. They didn't show you the doctors. They didn't show you the lawyers. They didn't show you any of the professionals. They only chose, you know, a few people, and they, of course, take sound bites, and they're using this concision to really shape this narrative like you're crazy if you don't want to suffocate yourself. Yeah, if you don't want to suffocate yourself, you are a crazy conspiracy theorist now who thinks you have the right to kill grandma. I mean, we're being called grandma killers, anti-maskers. The discrimination that we're seeing on this issue is like civil rights era level discrimination. If you look in our complaint, we have cited to a woman being kicked out of Trader Joe's, who was then called Trader Karen, and humiliated in front of everybody on and now the internet. You have a man and his 2 children were kicked out of Walmart. And you're seeing stories like this all over. I mean, my phones have been off the hook. My voicemail has been maxed out. If anybody who's watching your show has tried to contact me, I'm sorry. We're being bombarded with, SOSs from people all over the country. And, you know, I've been encouraging people, you know, look, you file complaints with the Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. There's a lot of, ways that you can, take action to stop this. It's not, it doesn't just have to be a lawsuit. There's laws and there's federal laws that are being violated, and I think people need to do whatever they can to defend themselves against these mandates, because they're unlawful. I don't care what the mayor says, and if he thinks that he's acting in the public interest, it doesn't really matter. Under Florida law and under the Florida Constitution, what they're doing is wrong.
And people can go to this GoFundMe page, right, Lewis? Palm Beach County lawsuit against mandatory masks, and they can make a financial contribution to help the lawsuit. Isn't that right?
Yes, this is was set up by a supporter of the lawsuit, and it's amazing to see how many people care enough to help the plaintiffs with the cost of this action, and they've raised money for other actions in other counties. But my understanding is that there's been lawsuits filed in Seminole, Orange, Miami-Dade, and other counties like Hillsborough. So there's several lawsuits now that have been filed. I don't believe an order has been entered adjudicating or deciding any particular mandate is or is not unconstitutional. But ours was not the first one. Let me just be clear about that. There's been other lawsuits. There's been lawsuits filed all over the country in similar fashion, and many judges are not tolerating this. They're striking down orders left and right that are essentially without authority. These are emergency powers are being abused, and like for example in Florida, the emergency powers.
You're saying the judges, they're striking down the county officials' orders, or they're striking down the lawsuits?
And no, in some states, we've seen governor's orders, that have been challenged. I think California, and several other places, New York, Wisconsin. Too many to name. We've seen state level mostly judges, but even some federal opinions where some of these orders have just exceeded, the bounds of emergency powers. So there certainly is hope. And I think, at least in our case, the Palm Beach County case, this should not survive judicial scrutiny. And I don't think any of these mandates should, because just look at freedom of speech. A mask is speech. It's a form of expression. So you're forcing people to adopt an expression, right? And you're not just restricting speech. You're restricting the ability to learn speech, right? Think about children. We want to talk about psychological impacts in children. Think about how many kids right now are not able to see the lips that are moving and actually hear. I mean, when we're wearing a mask, your voice is muffled.
What about deaf people?
Think about how many,
they
how
can't
many
read
people
lips.
can't actually use lip reading. It's really shocking to think that this was not even considered when they passed these mandates. They disregarded many people. And I've talked to doctors who actually sent studies to these commissioners and all over this is happening. People are actually showing the science to these people, and it's just being ignored. So they're guided by something other than science, and I think that's to me a sign that this isn't about public health, safety, welfare, morals anymore. It's about control, and it's about getting people to assimilate and to really waive their rights, because we talk about that a lot in the criminal context, and people waive their rights all the time. They don't even realize it when a police officer pulls them over and asks them questions. Well, when you're answering those questions, you're waiving your right to remain silent. Okay, so it's no different when you put that mask on, and because they told you to, you're waiving your right to say no to it. And a lot of people are okay with that, but that doesn't make it lawful. That doesn't make it constitutional. I mean, unconstitutional orders and unconstitutional, edicts happen all the time, and people let them slide. So I think we're at this point, at least with in Florida, people have had enough of it. I mean, for months they've tried to get their officials to listen and to be guided by something other than fear, right? Because your constitutional rights don't end where someone else's fear begins.
Right.
You know what I mean? We need to remember that. We need to remember that if you don't use your rights, right, you don't assert them, you lose them. And that's all. If anything that we can teach people through this lawsuit is that they do have rights, and they have to respect that, because we all share them, and they're fundamental, especially the right to choose what goes on your face. I mean, my God, I can't believe we have to even explain that to people. But you know what? If we have to, we will. And we want the court to rule and to give us, a permanent injunction with respect to this mandate, because it should never happen again. Well, I mean, what's to stop them from doing it, right? If there's no order in place that says you can't do this, because they clearly believe that this is lawful. If you listen to the mayor, I sent you a link here to the mayor's statement following the lawsuit being filed. He's confident that they're going to win, and I think a lot of officials are, and I think that goes back to the qualified immunity issue. It goes back to this notion of immunity. Many public officials believe they are above the law. They think that they can do whatever they want, and if they hurt somebody, well, they're insulated by immunity. And I think we need to take that away. I love the idea of having a qualified immunity act that evens the playing field, so that officials can be held accountable for their misconduct or abuse of their power, and violating clearly established law. I think if any law is clearly established in Florida, it's the Article 1 rights that we've had for generations.
Yeah. And what you're saying, Louis, it takes me back to what Jared brought up earlier, that this doesn't seem to be scientifically based. There is a lot of propaganda. There is a lot of psychological manipulation going on. And it takes me back to this New York Times article. This was one of the first real big media pushes towards this, pandemic in New York City and all this really apocalyptic outbreak. Take a look at this. You guys have dealt with medical malpractice stuff, and I know you're not doctors, but I can tell you that they do not put patients in beds with their shoes on. And that's very strange. And other MDs that I showed this to were literally shocked that a doctor would run a video recorder in the ICU. From the standpoint of a cinematographer, I've observed a lot of videos that this woman, Colleen Smith, has made, including a presentation that she gave about simulating trauma. And this woman cannot operate a PowerPoint remote. So, I mean, I know that people are specialized in what they're specialized in, but I don't think she's a very skilled cinematographer, and a lot of this looks like video that's shot by someone who's trying to make it look like it was shot by an amateur. I also want to point out that New York Health and Hospitals controls both Elmhurst Hospital Center and Lincoln Hospital. And there was another nurse who came forward from Lincoln Hospital, and her name was Nicole, and she was exposing Lincoln Hospital. So she was talking about how they're killing, so we do see that they're investigating. This is the first I've seen this. So a New York City hospital is investigating a nurse for sharing video footage with The Intercept. Now, frankly, this is something that the New York hospital should do, because although we want people to come forward with information, if this is talking about the nurse Nicole Siratek, I think her name was, I'm a little bit troubled by these out-of-town nurses coming to their own conclusions. And I mean, it could be a worthwhile thing for us to have access to, but at the same time, as Jared pointed out, how do we know that these aren't people planting counter-propaganda? I made a serious effort to get in touch with this nurse. Yeah. She said she wanted to speak to people, couldn't find her on social media. I found a phone number for one of her relatives, and it matched up as being, I presume her mom. I called many, many times, got the voicemail confirming the name, but no answer and no response. So for a nurse who wanted to get the word out, that was very strange to me. I also want to point out that in the 1960s and the 1970s, the Weather Underground was very active in trying to subvert the U.S. government. And I've been talking about this quite a lot lately. I didn't know this until just a few days ago, but this is from a book about the takeover of Lincoln Hospital in the 1970s. And they created their own Lincoln Hospital detox center, and this is where the author met Jennifer Dorn. This is the younger sister of Bernadine Dorn.
Bernadette.
And,
okay.
Right. And they were with the Weather Underground. They had taken over Lincoln Hospital and converted it into a junkie detox center. It's also very interesting to note that Jennifer Dorn is amazingly on faculty at Columbia University's School of Nursing. So I start to wonder about...
All of those Weather Underground people did remarkably well. I mean, the son of the people that were involved in some bombing, Chesa Boudin is like the Attorney General
he's the
of
District Attorney of San Francisco now.
Yeah. His Michael Boudin, the brother of Chesa Boudin's mother, is a federal appellate judge.
Whoa.
His wife taught me constitutional or federal law, federal courts at Harvard, Martha Field.
Wow.
Okay. Yeah, so these people that were part of a literal terrorist organization in the 70s have done very, very well in terms of ascending the strata of American society. And so you have to wonder if there's not an intimate and deep connection between those tactics that were honed in the 70s and the propaganda tactics that we're seeing now that emanate from various organs of the deep state. I think there is. personally.
Well, we don't have to wonder, Jared, because we know
Yeah.
that there's a very close relationship between Barack Obama and Weather Underground co-founder Bill Ayers. They're pictured here. And of course, Barack Obama was mentored by Bernadine Dorn at the Sidley Austin law firm. Barack Obama's wife, Michelle, was the Associate Dean of Students at Chicago University, where Dr. Colleen Smith was an undergraduate. So there's a remarkable number of connections between all of these people. Louis, you're looking quite intrigued by some of these things. What do you think about what we're saying?
I'm learning a lot. Keep going. A lot of this,
Well, we're almost
this is news to me, so I welcome the history lesson.
We're almost out of time for tonight, but this is a subject I've been following very closely, and I'm actually working on another episode for tomorrow with David Hawkins, where we're going to dig into some of the FBI connections to some of this, how the Weather Underground managed to evade incarceration and actually become embedded in the government and state hospital systems. Bernadine Dorn issued a audio recorded manifesto to a radio station in which she specifically said, guard your hospitals, guard your universities, guard your children, guard your airplanes, guard your banks. They robbed a Brinks truck, and Governor Cuomo commuted the sentence of someone who is an accessory to murder in a Brinks robbery because he met with her for a half an hour and decided she was just driving the car. So we need to defund the police. We need to release violent criminals from jail, put them in charge of hospitals, put them in charge of universities, get them educating the youth in the ways of Marxist insurrection, put them out in the street, destroying public property, threatening the lives of citizens, threatening the lives of peace officers and law enforcement officers. This is what Black Lives Matter, Antifa, and all of these leftist, Marxist insurrection organizations want. Shocking.
Yeah. Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
gentlemen,
I find it. Yeah. No. The thing I find interesting is that the propaganda is all about wear a mask, social distance, but then there are these ad hoc exceptions that are created for Black Lives Matter protests, but not other kinds of protests. I mean, doesn't that really tell you? Doesn't that really tell you all you need to know? That there's an interconnected propaganda operation going on, and that what you're seeing in terms of the protests, what you're seeing in terms of the coronavirus mandates are intimately connected, coordinated, and predetermined.
Absolutely.
I mean,
look at this, Jared. We've got a hippie buffet right here. They were literally giving out lasagna and salad, and look at how close people are sitting to each other. Obviously, sanitary conditions in terms of bathrooms, we heard in Seattle there was feces all over the place and people shooting each other at night. I mean, this is not some peaceful love fest paradise. This is, anarchy for a day, and after a week it turns into rule by force and murder. And if we were to actually follow these mandates and really defund the police, I don't think we'd have a peaceful world. I think we would just have a bunch of anarchy, basically.
Yeah.
I
mean, it's it's again, and you see the justifications that people give. They're like, well, racism is a health issue that trumps the health issues of the pandemic. I mean, people actually say that. No, I've seen this offered as a justification for why, these people you're showing on the video don't have to walk around with masks and can, eat their food.
Well, the ironic thing is, Jared, most of these people were wearing masks, and actually there was somebody at this protest who photographed me for not wearing a mask, despite the fact that we're outside. It was like 90 degrees. We've now heard doctors say that above a certain ambient temperature, the thing cannot live, cannot become airborne because the density of the air is such that I'm not a scientist, but obviously we're not having the kind of outbreaks that, when they told us in February that this was like the most deadly thing since machine gun fire, you would think that, people were frightened to leave their apartments, much less gather in a cluster like this in a park and roll around in their own filth eating baked ziti. It doesn't make sense at all.
No, what you're watching is automatons. I mean, these are not people that are actually thinking for themselves. They're being prompted into action by intense propaganda, and it's sad to see. I mean, because in my mind, it's a coextensive with the crumbling of American society.
Any last thoughts before we close it out, Jared, and then we'll hear from Lewis?
I really don't have any last thoughts except for this. I mean, it's a real privilege to be involved with folks like Lewis and the incredible legal team that he's assembled to push this lawsuit forward. And I would just want to emphasize that if anything is going to change for the better in the U.S., it's going to come from efforts like these, which involve a lot of hard work and facing the serious problems that we are encountering and the diminishment of our rights head on, and going into court and standing up, taking a stand in public, coming out of the shadows, coming off of the sidelines, and doing the right thing. It's not going to change if all you're doing is sitting back and chattering about a storm of justice that's supposedly working its way in the background, and all this nonsense about sealed indictments that we hear from time to time, and the Q babble, essentially. That, I think, is counterproductive, and it makes people passive, and it actually works against the efforts that people like Lewis and other lawyers on his team are really trying to push forward. And it actually makes me kind of angry when I see that, because I think the two movements those two things are really at cross purposes. I mean, I know, for instance, yesterday, Ghislaine Maxwell was arrested, and that's going to generate a lot of excitement, I think, in the Q crowd of, it's happening, the pedos are being rounded up, and Q predicted this, and blah, blah, blah. This is theater, okay? Ghislaine Maxwell, Jeffrey Epstein, that's all theater. This woman was running around the U.S. With impunity for like a year, right? And nobody did anything. And, now suddenly she's being picked up. I mean, why didn't she flee the country? Why didn't she take refuge somewhere else? It's because she's part of it. She's part of the deep state effort to distract, to tantalize, to make people think that things are happening in the realm of justice when they're actually not.
Oh,
and
wait a minute.
And I really,
What is this 20 CR 330? What is that? That's the criminal charge?
I see 2 3s in there, which
yes.
always makes me suspicious. But yeah, I mean, it's and people, should really just tune that stuff out, okay? Because the important stuff is actually happening on the ground. It's happening when material changes are made to your life. Like, you can't run your business anymore. You have to go outside and wear a face mask and impede your own breathing and obscure your own identity. That's where the efforts need to be directed, not at this Hollywood show business stuff, which is meant to distract. And it's, to me, this is just I mean, as we're getting close to the election, you're going to see more stuff like this to make it seem like the government that's in power is actually doing something. But, at the end of the day, I personally think that Trump has been a huge disappointment from the campaign promises he made in terms of draining the swamp and bringing justice against people like Hillary Clinton, who have betrayed the country. And I think that, William Barr chose this particular time to pick up Maxwell after he fired the New York attorney. But it's all political show, and we're still going to have rafts of unprosecuted child prostitution and pedophile networks in this country. This isn't going to change a thing. What people need to really pay attention to is lawyers like Louis Leo, who are actually doing the really hard, thankless work of fighting these petty tyrants in court. And they need your help, they need your assistance, they need your support, they need your attention. Take your attention off the TV, off the Hollywood style script that's being dangled in front of you, and these terrible psyops like Q. Focus on, the real legal heroes, which in my opinion are people like Lewis and his team.
Well said, Jared. Lewis, any closing remarks?
Thanks, Jared, and I think Jared and I will likely be working on many more cases to follow. That's my hope, especially in this realm, which we've been drawn to. I don't think anybody really becomes a lawyer and wants to do constitutional law, but when you're faced with the mass deprivation of civil rights under the guise of disease prevention, and to the point where now our very right to breathe fresh air is being taken from us, we really have no choice but to band together. And I think that people can learn from what's happening, not just in Palm Beach County, but other counties where people are coming together, they're crowdfunding because our system is so cost prohibitive. And it is so volatile, and the cost to get not just from, to a judgment, but to get past the appeal is so extraordinary that most people are just deterred from even thinking about it. But our hope in creating this complaint, which you'll read is very long, it was to show not only the court the law and the science, but so everybody who reads it, and the media and the people who come across this can also replicate this in their own county, to challenge not just mask mandates, but any forced medical treatments. That includes vaccination. They want to come out with a shot that's never been tested before and pretend like Jacobson, authorizes plunging that needle in your arm. Something that's completely unsafe and essentially, is turning people into guinea pigs. We need to stand against that, and the public has a strong interest in protecting our constitutional and fundamental rights, not just under the Florida Constitution, but our human rights, inalienable rights, as the founding fathers so eloquently wrote in our very foundational operating system. That really it hasn't survived this long by remaining silent. Americans had to fight for these rights, and we've had to defend them in court. We've had to challenge this tyranny in the past. This is nothing new. It's just different today. And unfortunately, people have forgotten. They forgot the anti-mask league of 1919. They forgot that the masks that they proposed in 1918 were a bad idea then, and it really hasn't changed. It's a bad idea now. We're seeing people getting hurt by it, and if we don't do something, if we don't have these orders rescinded or struck down as unconstitutional, then countless people, countless American citizens in our county and others are going to suffer irreparable harm. So, we're obviously going to continue doing what we're doing until we have a judgment, hopefully an injunction against this mandate, which can be replicated in other counties and perhaps other states who are looking to do the same. And again, we're if anybody wants to help support the cause, or any other cases, any other mandates that are being proposed or that have been enacted, you can email info@floridacivil-rights.org, and we'll certainly do what we can to help as we can.
Excellent. Very well said, Lewis. Thank you both so much for coming on the show tonight. People are going to go and visit floridacivil-rights.org to contact Lewis, or beckandlee.com to reach Jared. Always exciting and interesting to have both of you guys on the show. I know I learn a lot, so thanks very much for joining me. I want to let people know that they can sponsor this show by going to subscribestar.com/crowdsourcethetruth or patreon.com/crowdsourcethetruth. Become a sponsor. You're going to enable me to keep bringing you great programs like this one with Louis Leo and Jared Beck. You're also going to get access to a huge library of sponsor-exclusive content, including tomorrow's episode with David Hawkins. We're going to be digging into this FBI connection to the Weather Underground. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining me, and thanks everybody for watching. Have a great night.
Thanks,
Thank
Jason.
you, Jason.